Morning, everyone. Happy Hump Day. Welcome to the News Agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox. And today I'm joined by the Mirror's Deputy Political Editor, Mr. Ben Glaze.
Hello,
And
good morning.
We're going to take you through the biggest stories of the day. We want you to get in the comments and tell us whatever's going on and what you think about them. Ask us your questions and we'll do our best to answer them for you. Now, I warn you in advance, my internet connection seems to be suffering with the rain this morning, so I will come and go. But Ben is going to be here in between times and hopefully we'll manage to limp through to the end. So what have we got today? Well, the Mirror has splashed on the story of Jenny McGee, one of the intensive care nurses who Boris Johnson has credited with saving his life when he says it could have gone either way when he had coronavirus. Now, Jenny has quit the NHS, enraged by that same Prime Minister's mishandling of the pandemic, which she believes led to the second wave and the 1% pay offer he's subsequently made. Now, Ben, she says that's insulting. But she's managed very effectively to give him an insult of her own here, hasn't she?
That's right, yeah. This is really embarrassing for the Prime Minister. If you remember, when he came out of hospital last April, he highlighted two nurses who cared for him when he'd been in intensive care with coronavirus at St Thomas Hospital in London. One was a Portuguese chap, and then the other was Jenny McGee, this New Zealand nurse who cared for him in intensive care. And they were both invited to number 10 to the garden where they met the Prime Minister, had tea, coffee, and posed for some of those pictures you saw. But now, 13 months on, Jenny's decided to leave the NHS. And one of the things she's blamed is the pay rise that the government is offering NHS staff. Now, it's pretty badly timed this because the government is offering a 1% pay rise in inverted commas. This morning, inflation figures are out showing that inflation is now 1.5%. So that means that pay rise is actually a pay cut because the pay salaries for the nurses and everyone else in the NHS will not be keeping pace with inflation. So if you compare what they were earning last year with what they'd earn under this 1% pay rise, there's actually a 0.5% pay cut. Now, the Prime Minister, the government says, well, actually, everyone else in the public sector is not getting a pay rise at all, so you should be grateful. Which actually means their pay is being cut by even more than the NHS staff.
Yeah, they can only afford 840 quid a roll wallpaper now.
Yeah. So this is one of those things that will probably come up at Prime Minister's questions at noon today, you'd have thought. And the government, so it's made its 1% offer. Currently, it's with the NHS pay review body, which is sort of an independent group, panel of experts. They look at the various cases, so the Royal Colleges, the health unions, they submit what they think staff should get. And then the pay review body makes its own independent recommendation, which we're expecting in the next few weeks. Then it's up to the government whether or not it abides by that recommendation, which you can imagine might be more than the 1% the government's offering, or whether the government sticks to its guns and says, actually, you're getting 1%. But the fact that this is very human now, because there's more than 1 million people working in the NHS, the fact that there is now one of the two staff who cared for the Prime Minister himself and was welcomed into Downing Street, that she is quitting, and one of the reasons she says she's quitting is this pay rise issue. That's very embarrassing for Boris Johnson.
Yeah, they've had a lot of issues with nurses leaving, haven't they? Especially in the past year with the pandemic making things worse. Now, William says, morning, William, will this make any difference to the nurses and the doctors? It depends really if this can cut through, doesn't it? And whether what Jenny McGee says is going to make any difference. I've got a little video I want to show you very quickly of something that Boris Johnson said when he came out of hospital last year.
I want to pay my own thanks to the utterly brilliant doctors, leaders in their fields, men and women, but several of them for some reason called Nick, who took some crucial decisions a few days ago, for which I will be grateful for the rest of my life. I want to thank the many nurses, men and women, whose care has been so astonishing. I'm going to forget some names, so please forgive me, but I want to thank Poling and Shannon and Emily and Angel and Connie and Becky and Rachel and Nikki and Anne. And I hope they won't mind if I mention in particular two nurses who stood by my bedside for 48 hours when things could have gone either way. They're Jenny from New Zealand, in Invercargill on the South Island to be exact, and Luis from Portugal near Porto.
Now, I'm sure that Pauline and Angel and Emily and Anne and Nikki and all the people called Nick are currently being contacted by journalists asking them if they agree with Jenny McGee and indeed if they're still in the NHS or not. But what William was just saying there is quite important, isn't it, Ben? Although this is in PMQs today and the Queen's speech and the pay rise to some extent is being debated in Parliament today, you know, is this going to make any difference? Because lots of doctors and nurses have complained about the pandemic handling. They've complained about the pay rise. And it only seems to convince people that are convinced to start with. You know, so if you don't like Boris Johnson to start with, this is great. It reinforces your opinion. If you do like him, you find a way to say this is okay. Now, she's speaking in a documentary that's timed to coincide with the anniversary of the Barnard Castle exclusive that the Mirror and the Guardian published last year. And she says they're not getting respect, and also that Number 10 tried to coerce her into a photo op during the clap for carers. And of course that there he is doing it on his own because she wouldn't stand next to him. And also that they mishandled that pandemic and led to that second wave last year, which was more horrendous than the first, in which Boris Johnson, of course, was in hospital and she met him. Is this going to make any difference? Is it going to change anything? Jenny McGee says, that's it, I'm off.
It gives a lot of ammunition to the critics who have been calling for a better pay rise for the NHS staff. Now you can stick a face on that campaign and those pleas and say, well, look, even the nurse who saved your life, someone that you credited, you know, you didn't single out because there were two people, but Jenny and Louise from Porto, Prime Minister specifically name-checked them in that video that we saw from last April. And it's just as an aside, it's worth listening to the Prime Minister there. He sounded very breathless even then. So you can see he was still in the recovery phase from coronavirus. Will it make any difference? Well, the issue is with the pay review body. They will draw up their recommendation. Whether the government chooses to accept it or not, whatever that recommendation may be, if they don't better that 1% offer, you can imagine that those words from Jenny McGee, from this Channel 4 documentary, they'll be replayed time and time again to show how the government has let down those staff, particularly that one member of staff that the Prime Minister himself credited with, let's face it, saving his life, because he was very seriously ill last spring.
Exactly.
So, yeah, I do think even if it doesn't make the difference in terms of increasing the government's pay offer, it's yet more fuel to that case.
Yeah. Now, as Isla just said, the French are paying their nurses much better than we are. Better for Britain, possibly not his real name. Says the independent commission will report back and the government will probably increase the pay rise. Now, call me a cynic, Ben, if you like. But these commissions aren't that independent, really. They're sort of nominally independent, but I'm sure someone has a word in someone else's ear at some point. We would like you to have 1%, 1.5%, whatever it might be, right? And that's the decision that comes through. I just assume that's quite one of the things that happens. And the issue you've got here is if the government recommends 1%, and the independent commission comes back and suggests 10%, let's say, which is never going to happen, then they can't possibly give into it because they would lose power, they'd lose authority, they'd have their spending decisions taken out of their hands and given to these, quangocrats. So the pay rise commission can't offer less, probably, and it can't offer significantly more. So there's going to have to be some kind of obfuscation of the figures where it's near enough 1%, 1.5%, 1.25%, or something, so the government doesn't lose face. That's going to be the real, compromise that gets made, isn't it?
One of the health unions, I think, was asking for 14% pay rise in recognition of the fact that the NHS have been under so much pressure over the past year. Well, obviously, that's not going to happen, 14%. Everyone puts in their bids, and the government, in putting in 1%, will probably have expected it will end up forking out a bit more than 1%. If it is offered 2%, well, then that gets bid up, and they might have to offer 3%. I'd expect a rise of around about 1.5% to 2% to be recommended, and the government will accuse them of U-turning and finally caving in. They'll say, oh, we've listened, we understand this was a particularly difficult time for the NHS, this is us responding, we've taken on board what's been said, and there will be some sort of compromise. And that is usually how these things work. The reason that the government can't go and give them like the 5-10% pay rise that the government might want to, because it'd be fantastic publicity, is one, that's not a one-off pay rise, that is a pay rise. So it is, that stays in effect for following years when there'll be other percentage increased pay rises. So it's an ever ballooning bill. But also, the public sector, as the government has made a big play of, everyone else in the public sector is getting a 0% pay rise. There is no pay rise. So that's a real terms cut. If they then gave a larger pay increase to the NHS of around 5 or 10%, for example, when everyone else in the public sector will go, well, hang on a minute, why are they getting that much and we're not getting any rise whatsoever?
Exactly. Prison officers are going to say, hang on, we've got to deal with COVID. And police officers and everyone else. Now, Christopher here says, how much do qualified nurses get a year? I've just been Googling it. Well, Ben was happily filling some airtime. And a band 5 nurse, freshly qualified, gets a starting salary, on average, £24,907. Now, I've just checked the UK average salary. And according to the Office of National Statistics, it's £38,600. So, although that's obviously compared to a starting salary of a nurse, as opposed to the average career salary, and the ONS statistic is about the average salary in the UK, they come in significantly under the average wage when they start. Now, Charlie says, we will effectively get a pay cut. You're a nurse. Hello, Charlie. Thank you very much. We're grateful. The Prime Minister's grateful. He's just, he's got that COVID memory loss thing going on. We have worked extra hours, often without breaks, terrified of contracting the virus and passing it on to our own families. It's an absolute joke. The NHS is definitely deserving of slightly more, surely. We're not after a huge rise, just better than 1%. Why can't they just, although they've got issues with the rest of the public sector, they are literally printing money at the moment, Ben. They are spending it like it's going out of fashion. They're giving millions of pounds, just throwing it out the door at people they met down the pub, at people who go to the dinner parties, at people who have left government in massive sex scandals. Mr. Brooks Newmark MP, former MP. Why can't they just give nurses, police officers, everybody in the public sector 2%? If inflation is 1.5%, give them 2%.
The argument the government would make, and obviously I'm not saying this is what I think, but that they've spent more than £300 billion fighting coronavirus and putting extra money into the NHS and all this PPE that they've had to buy, etc., and that because people have been out of work and because the furlough bill's been so high, paying people not to work, that there is no money left. That it's not just there's no money left for borrowing to stay afloat. That would be their argument. It would be interesting to hear from Charlie. I know she said they're not asking for a lot, just more than 1%. I would, if you're still on, if you can reply and say what you are looking for. If you are looking for 2%, I'd be interested to hear that, because to try and gauge what nurses who, as she says, been on the front line for the last 14, 15 months, and understands how little money there is around in public coffers, what you think is a reasonable rise that the government could offer.
Yeah. Now, Lindsay says here, I'm a nurse and I can't be more grateful for the security of my job, especially in a pandemic. Never going to not need nurses and teachers. All right. Journalists and everybody else, we can probably live without. Hairdressers and so on. Slightly more important. Over the years, we should have had a better pay rise. I agree. This is not the time. And I've no issue with that as long as no one gets a pay rise, including my MP. My back goes up when MPs get the large pay rises and bonus. You're quite right, Lindsay. There's an alternative view, isn't it, that perhaps we don't have the money at the moment. We shouldn't spend it. But I would raise one point, both to you and Lindsay. If you spend £300 billion fighting a pandemic and it goes PPE and stuff goes out the door, a lot of that it's just gone, right? British companies have to pay corporation tax, and any British person that gains from that will have to pay income tax. But a lot of it went foreign. And the ultimate person who's providing the PPE was usually in a foreign country. Whereas if you pay nurses 2% more, they're spending their money in the UK. They're getting taxed in the UK. They're fueling the UK economy. If you pay the public sector, whatever, you get it back in spades. I don't understand the idea that if you give money to a nurse, it's the same as giving money to someone who's based in Monaco and it just goes, you never see it again. It's stupid.
You're talking about the multiplier effect, whereby £1 spent on a public sector worker ends up being £4 spent in the economy. Yeah, there's, that argument it doesn't just hold for paying British workers more, it also holds for procurement contracts, not just around PPE, but other things. That if there's big defence contract at the moment I've been writing about for a couple of years, where the government has £1.5 billion to spend on 3 new warships. Is it going to give it to a British firm? Is it going to give it to a Spanish firm? If you give it to a Spanish firm and you employ several hundred, couple of thousand Spanish workers, they'll spend all their money in Spain. If you give it to a British firm, they'll spend all the money in Britain. They'll go down the pub, they'll order takeaways, they'll go on holidays in Britain, for example. And yeah, the money stays on shore and people are paying tax on that. And it is a benefit to the overall economy. If you do that with abroad, the money goes abroad and it doesn't come back.
Yeah, and as defence contracts, there's security issues as well with doing stuff abroad, I should have thought. Now, I keep asking short questions. What do you think about the 1% pay rise? Is it too much? Is it not enough? Should there be more? Is Jenny McGee right or wrong to quit the NHS? She does say she hopes to come back at some point. So, who knows? Hopefully she does return. Helen says, what about care home workers? Nobody minded them putting their lives on the line for a pittance of pay. Privately funded service, privately run service, and you just don't get the same career progression and the same standards and regulations as you do in the NHS, unfortunately. Everybody minded care home workers, and they just didn't get quite the public support from the government that they should have done. Now, before we move on to the next story, I just want to say one quick thing. There was a number 10 statement that was put out about Jenny last night, which says that it has done everything in its power to support nurses. Now, that sounds to me, Ben, like the PM saying a pay rise or respect for the nurses or handling the pandemic in some way are therefore not in his power. So whose hands is all this in? Is Boris blaming like Rishi Sunak for blocking a bigger pay rise to nurses? Is that the undercurrent here? That
sort of. It's not obviously it's not quite as simple as that, but the Treasury is mindful of the fact that tax revenues have gone down and that bills have gone up. And yes, the Treasury is always reluctant to start spending money left, right, and centre. That is a fact. And this Prime Minister, more than others we've had for quite a long time, likes making people happy. Boris boosterism. He likes throwing money around. The issue there being that someone has to rein him in a bit, take the credit card off him, take the checkbook off him. I think actually sometime last year, Rishi Sunak did actually joke about taking the Prime Minister's credit card away. Well, the Prime Minister, his credit card is our taxes. And it was interesting as well with Helen mentioning about carers. Well, of course, people were saying carers should be paid more. The Daily Mirror, most of all, saying carers should be paid more, as well as the carers were saying that. But your point about it being in the private sector, that is an issue there, because a carer for one care firm will get paid more or less than a carer in another care firm. There is no standardised rates because it isn't a nationalised service. And there are obviously some people who believe there should be a national care service. We're still waiting for the Prime Minister's plan on social care. It's nearly 2 years since he said he had one ready to go. Still waiting to see it, but we're expecting that later this year. And the hope is it may include higher rates of pay, which is certainly, the Mirror actually has a campaign called Fair Care for All, and one of those is better rates of pay for carers.
I bet you any money it will be limited to a cap on costs, and that will actually drive pay and conditions down, and care right down, and there'll be no national care service whatsoever, even though that would be a great legacy of the pandemic and of any government of any colour. I mean, if I was Prime Minister, it's the first thing I'd do, day one, and after having sorted out the nuclear test veterans. Anyway, thank you for explaining that, Ben. Thank you for your questions, everybody. Now, moving on, Ben's got a story in the paper, everybody. Woohoo! Over there on the right-hand side of the spread about Jenny McGee, Andy Burnham, King of the North, is in tears. Or actually, he's not in tears, not yet. But he says it's likely that parts of Greater Manchester may face local restrictions as these have manifestly not worked against the Kent variant last year that ripped through the country and contributed to this second wave that we had. So, Ben, what's his problem? Why doesn't he want tears?
Yeah, so at the moment, we're obviously seeing a higher number of cases of the Indian variant of coronavirus. It's centred in various different pockets of the United Kingdom, but two of the worst affected areas are Bolton and Blackburn. Obviously, Greater Manchester Metro Mayor Andy Burnham points to what happened back in the autumn, where, if you remember, he had this standoff with Westminster about local lockdowns and who was going to fund them. And the government wanted, Boris Johnson had talked about this whack-a-mole strategy after we got the cases down really low in the summer, that when new pockets of infection popped up, he would whack a mole and they would be struck down. That was through the local lockdowns. Now, the plan didn't work because eventually we ended up in a national lockdown in November. And then in the first week of January, another national lockdown, which we're still emerging from and will be for the next sort of 6 weeks, 2 months, maybe even longer. Burnham is saying that he's written an exclusive op-ed for us in the Mirror, which is in a paper and a longer version online. He's saying that they didn't work then. There's no reason they should work now. The government should stick with national restrictions. And he's saying that they break trust because we've all been told that, cautious and irreversible lifting of lockdown, key on the irreversible bit. If you suddenly then had to tell people in places like Bolton, your non-essential shops are shutting again, your pubs are shutting again, you have to stay at home again. Well, when can you believe the government? Like, you end up in this in out, and he is warning that already trust is quite low in public institutions and certain things the government says, and this would make it worse. So Boris Johnson's left the door open to local lockdowns, which is potentially quite a sensible thing to do, because we don't know yet how this Indian variant, how infectious it is. We understand it's more infectious than the Kent variant, but not quite how much. The data is coming in all the time. In the next couple of weeks, we should have a lot more data and many more statistics showing how transmissible it is, and therefore what needs to be done in terms of clamping down on it.
Right. And so he's just saying that the lockdowns don't work. Last time people were driving, in and out of lockdown areas. It has a huge impact on the economy. He says that obviously Leicester's been locked down pretty much since the pandemic began. Bits of Manchester have had problems for a long time as well compared to other parts of the country. But what's really sort of remarkable in here is that there's no real solutions to this. What do you do instead of having a local lockdown? Burnham is very good at picking a fight with Boris Johnson, and as a Metro Mayor, it doesn't really matter if you win or lose that fight. You just have to be seen to be fighting for your area. But did his piece get cut so that the solutions were left out, which I would find very unlikely, or does he not really have any? How do you get around the issue of not having a local lockdown then?
Well, to a certain extent, he doesn't have to come up with solutions because the data's still coming in on it. He's always, quite rightly, is the representative for Greater Manchester. He's fought for his area. It's not really his responsibility what happens in the rest of the country. That is the Prime Minister's responsibility. So what he wants is to fight for his region. Perfectly understandable. And yes, it does him no harm. Remember, we've got that moniker that you referred to as the King of the North in autumn for standing up, and it was re-elected with a big majority a couple of weeks ago as Greater Manchester Metro Mayor. So yeah, it is beholden on him to fight for his area, and being at odds with number 10 Boris Johnson over that's going to do him no harm whatsoever.
Yeah, as I've said many times before, and I'm going to say it again, every time that in history someone got exiled from court and went to the north and built up a little power base, it was called civil war or insurrection. This was happening when Henry VIII was running the place. Andy Burnham would be beheaded just to be on the safe side. This is not a man who has given up on running the country, despite all the Labour Party, despite having lost twice. This is a man who's on manoeuvres, if you ask me. Now, Mike says,
image now of Burnham reenacting the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Great.
Yeah, go for it,
that was the English Civil War, of course. That was precursor to 1066. But anyway.
Yeah, I think depends which side you're saying is the conqueror, I think, at Stamford Bridge. Now, Mike Holden, morning, Mike. Can we call the latest strain the Johnson strain? It may have originated in India, but it's here thanks to his inaction. And the Mirror reports flights are still coming in from India today. And they are now a red list country. They should be tested, quarantined, so on. But we have this issue that Burnham mentions in his piece of very low self-isolation payments. And all this, I don't like this finger pointing to people from Bolton not having the vaccine, silly you, when we wouldn't have the Indian strain in anywhere near this greater number if we had decent self-isolation payments and they had closed the borders properly.
This story that Andy refers to about the flights, so that's a Mirror exclusive story. That read it online today. It's an important story. This. So I'm a bit of an aviation geek, and I've been monitoring the flights on flight tracking systems and Heathrow arrivals, etc., on flights coming in from India. And the 3 landed this morning, actually, from India at Heathrow. And you can see them literally come in, you know, and then pass over London and touch down at Heathrow. And 3 had gone down, landed by about 7:30 this morning. They are big passenger planes. They are, you know, proper passenger airlines. Each one is capable of holding more than 250 people. It's not to say there's 250 people on it, but we know from publicly available data that more than 4,000 people have come in from India since April the 22nd, and it went on the red list on April the 23rd. Now, there was a common belief that all direct flights from red list countries were banned. You know, if you'd been in a red list country and you're British or Irish national, you could still come back, but you had to fly from a different country. So you could get yourself from, for example, India into a neighbouring country that wasn't on the red list and fly back. That's fine. When India was placed on the red list, there are 4 exemptions to that direct flight ban. There's India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Kenya. So direct flights are still available from those 4 countries into the United Kingdom, even though they're on the red list, and people are taking advantage of them, and they are coming in. And you can't really blame them, because the government could ban those flights if they wanted to. They've opted not to, and the airlines are still flying people in, and the people are still coming in on the planes. And this all the while that the Indian variant is growing in this country and is likely very quickly to become the dominant strain of coronavirus. Now, does anyone think that's sensible? Hopefully people, you know, will look at the stats and will make their own minds up.
I'm sure there'll be some people on those flights who are taking the opportunity to leave the dreadful situation in India and get somewhere safer. And I'm sure there are people, families that are trying to reunite and so on, having been to India to care for loved ones and then trying to come home. And that surely the issue is as well, and it's reasonable for them perhaps to come home, but that they should be properly tested and quarantined when they do, so that they're not bringing any strain in or infecting others. And that's what's not happening.
Everyone coming into the UK is supposed to be tested. You know, you have to show the proof of test, and everyone coming in from red list countries does have to go to these government-approved hotels, which you have a 10-night stay, and it costs you £1,750 on top of the cost of your holiday or trip abroad and the cost of your flights to and from. That is what is supposed to happen, and it is supposed to prevent strains, mutant variants coming into the UK. Well, is it working? The data would suggest it probably isn't, and certainly Labour makes the case that it doesn't seem to be working. No,
it seems to be very porous. And Sage did suggest back, I think it was in May, they told Boris Johnson that, you know, his hotel quarantine idea was not going to work unless you properly closed the borders and then quarantine the few who come in. Because if you allow travel to happen, then, you know, because you could maybe quarantine everybody who's flying direct from India, but if someone's flown in from, say, Portugal, and they happen to bump into someone who was carrying the Indian strain while they're in Portugal, or someone who had recently flown from India to Portugal, they're going to bring the strain in the back door, aren't they? So everyone's busy blaming India.
We are finding more of these arrivals at airports are standing, if you're coming in from a green list country or even an amber list, they're finding themselves in the arrivals hall next to people from the red list countries before they're carted off to their government hotel quarantine. Yeah, exactly. Now, we do have, at least you've explained that for us, and we've any more questions you've got, ask us and we'll try and answer them at the end, about the 1% pay rise or about the local lockdowns and restrictions. Are you in Manchester? Are you happy to be in tiers again? Presumably not, but, you know, how are you going to get around it? What's the solution if we don't have that? But we do have, first of all, some good news, and it's all about the planet, and here it is. England's going to get more beaver, everybody. The Environment Secretary, George Eustace, gave a speech yesterday in which he said that wildcats and golden eagles could be reintroduced in England, beavers released more widely. And there's a new task force is going to look at bringing back some extinct species or threatened species and declining species and try and bring them back into the environment. They're talking about also curlews, redback shrikes, pine martens, which I think we have actually got or been reintroduced before, but there aren't very many of them. So I think the issue here, they're saying that, you know, bringing back an apex predator like a golden eagle actually restores food chains. It improves things a lot for everybody else further down the food chain, although they do get eaten by an eagle at some point.
And I think, Ben, we should bring back wolves.
Yeah,
I like how.
I'm quite taken by this rewilding concept, which has been around for a few years, and this is the latest iteration of it. So obviously it wasn't great that these things were hunted to extinction locally, several hundred years ago. But it's quite a big decision then to decide to bring them back, because obviously things have moved on. If we're saying there are too many rabbits in the wild, well, it's good to introduce and reintroducing golden eagles, who are like, they're very, very prevalent, but there's lots of them in the Scottish Highlands already, and they're moving south. Is that the best solution? Because then the farmers get up in arms about like the baby lambs that the eagle might want to eat. And you start upsetting people, and they start shooting them again. And, I live not far from one of the royal parks, which has got lots of deer in it. Now, that's fine. They're wild animals, right?
You're obviously in a palace.
But then some people want the deer to be like, they're culled once or twice a year. There's a deer cull. Well, instead of culling them with marks and with guns, well, why don't we introduce lynx to the royal parks to eat the deer? And this thing about the curlews as well. I went to a nature reserve a couple of weeks ago, not far from where I live, and I've got a really nice picture of 2 curlews, in fact. So I didn't even know that they weren't supposed to be around. Like, we see some of these quite regularly. The beavers down on the River Otter in Devon, well, they're there. Now, the problem with the beavers is, well, this is good if for flood management reasons, because the beavers build the dams. That's great, but then they're going to go and flood the fields, those dams. If it depends what you want, right? Because every action has a consequence. So if you want to introduce the beavers, okay, and I've got no objection to the beavers, right? But if you do introduce them, then there's going to be flooding on the farmland, and the farmers are going to get upset again. And then there's a golden eagle flying in to eat the farmer's lamb. Well, they're going to get even more upset, aren't they? So as long as we're aware of, this sounds good, golden eagles. Yeah, I'd love to see a golden eagle in the wild, right? I saw a red kite the other day, and they used to be only back home in mid Wales. Now they're all over the Chilterns. There's loads of them. They are eating some of the small mammals. If that's what we want them to do, fine, crack on. But it will have an impact on other things. It's not wholly a great idea. And I'm not even an expert in this. I'm just someone who's a bit fascinated by it and can see, like, in 20 years, we're going, well, why did we introduce those golden eagles again? Now they're taking all the lambs. Like, what about the wildcats? And will we be complaining in decades to come? Well, that was a stupid thing to do, wasn't it? Just because it sounded nice at the time.
Yeah. What kind of animal would you like to see reintroduced, Ben?
Dragons.
Everything you've just said, what could possibly go wrong with reintroducing a dragon?
Fire-breathing dragons. I mean, they would literally light up the night sky. It'd be great. And yeah, I'd like to see them. I mean, Harry Potter, and obviously being Welsh, it being my national symbol.
I think we get a lot more fires, a lot more wildfires. Virgins would have a terrible time. And all the pound coins would go out of circulation because they'd be sitting on a hoard, wouldn't they?
The dragon. Well, yes, arguably in their lairs, but then they'd be flying across the sky. People would be entertained by them. Well, there'd be a flight limit, of course. They wouldn't be able to go over an altitude of 1,000 feet, for example, and they could argue it out with the drones.
Okay, we'll tell dragons to stay under 1,000 feet and see how they take it, shall we? Now, I'm sorry, I'm still thinking about Ben and Beaver. Now, Neil says, if you're a newspaper, I'm not, Neil, but I'm a human being, but thanks for saying, if you're a newspaper, why did you not report the 500,000 or more protesters in London last month? Question mark, question mark, question mark. I don't know. Did we, Ben? Did we not?
Well, I don't know what protest he's referring to. If it was an anti-lockdown protest.
500,000.
I mean, they weren't
the anti-lockdown protests. I think they did get covered, and in particular the number of arrests, because the people who go on the anti-lockdown protests tend not to worry about social distancing or masks.
There hasn't been a protest with 500,000 people on it in London.
No,
for more than a year, let alone last month.
No, you're talking 500,000 wasn't even the women's march that I went on that actually rammed the place. So it wasn't 500,000, I'm afraid. Although, wherever you're seeing that, that's why it's not in a national newspaper, because the figures couldn't be verified and aren't true, Neil. Lorraine, good morning. Why is the NHS asking for a pay rise when you get millions on furlough, some still working that don't even get a pay rise? So So do, but not much. And even if you do get a pay rise, when you're going to learn that goes in one hand and comes out the other?
Well, there's the alternative argument against the NHS pay rise. I mean, what Lorraine's obviously referring to is the state of the economy as a whole, and that in some public sectors, as we said earlier, they aren't getting even a 1% pay rise. She is right that, you know, if you are going to give someone a pay rise, then you either have to take more in tax, or you have to borrow more, which eventually means you have to tax more to pay it back, etc. But yeah, those are the arguments that the government's grappling with. You
can tax NHS workers more because they've got more pay. So, win-win. Julia says, why do you constantly get individuals saying they need a pay rise? Everyone deserves pay rises and get them most years. Still waiting for mine. Nurses had no pay rise for 7 years. Then the nurses on top grade got no pay increase the last 3 years. That to me is a pay cut for most nurses. I think the Mirror reported a while ago that effectively over the past 10 years, nursing has had like a third cut in real terms in some bands. Some areas of nursing have had a 30-odd% pay cut effectively.
Yeah, so after the 2010 election, when the coalition introduced the austerity measures, which froze pay in most public sector occupations, obviously at the same time inflation was going up, so that is a real terms pay cut, as we were discussing earlier. I think there were certain exemptions for certain bands and levels, but yes, as an argument that there wasn't a pay rise for several years for most nurses.
Yeah, exactly. Which is a bit of a sad note to end it on. But thank you, Ben, for joining me. We've got plenty of dinosaurs and dragons and stuff around the place as it is. So I don't think we're going to follow Ben's instruction to reintroduce them. But keep an eye out for Beaver, everybody. Now, thank you, Ben. And thank you, dear viewer, as well, for tuning in and asking us your questions. And we will see you all again next Monday for another edition of the News Agenda. Bye-bye.